Hey YouTube, today I'm going to give you a quick video tutorial on how to replace the lower ball joint or the entire lower control arm assembly on a 2004 Nissan Murano SUV. Now the complaint on this particular vehicle is that the lower ball joint has developed some play, and of course Nissan doesn't create a control arm assembly that has a serviceable lower ball joint. So the only option here is to go ahead and replace the entire lower control arm. Okay, so one of the first steps that we need to do, of course, is raise the vehicle up. And but before we do that, make sure that you firmly apply the parking brake, chock both rear wheels, and of course use an appropriate jack stand beside your hydraulic jack to support the vehicle in the event that the hydraulic jack should fail. Once we've got the vehicle jacked up and then we can lower it slightly onto our jack stand supports, we can then go ahead and remove the front wheel on the SUV. Using a 21mm socket, remove the front wheel. So the lower control arm assembly is actually this piece right here. And essentially where the vehicle has developed some play in the suspension is actually the lower ball joint, which is actually directly located underneath this section here. Now it's fairly straightforward to take this out, and basically how Nissan's designed their suspension is the ball joint is actually just held in with a simple pinch bolt, and we just got to loosen up a few components here, and then we should be able to break this lower control arm free from the actual hub assembly right here, and then unbolt the rest of the control arm. Now I'm not sure how well you guys can see all of this in the video, but essentially where the control arm attaches to on the vehicle, I'm going to give it a liberal spraying with some WD-40 or some penetrating lubricant so that it makes this entire removal process that much easier. More often than not, if you take the time to preemptively just spray things down with some penetrating oil, it'll just make removing everything that much faster and easier on you. So guys, this is what a new control arm assembly looks like. And so right here in the silver portion is the rearward section of the vehicle. This here bolts onto the lower subframe on the front, and of course there's the ball joint with the little pinch bolt groove on the front here. So fairly straightforward to remove. So let's go ahead and start taking this apart. Using a 22mm wrench on the back nut, a 17mm impact gun, you can go ahead and remove the pinch bolt off of the ball joint. This is what that bolt looks like once it's been removed. Using a 19mm socket, preferably on an impact gun, proceed to remove this bolt here and the bolt behind it to remove this portion of the control arm. This is what those two bolts look like once they've been removed. Next, using a 19mm socket, remove the front swing pivot portion of the control arm. You may need to use a breaker bar to break this bolt free, as there isn't much room to work with and you can't get an impact gun into this area. This is what the large bolt was on the front portion of the control arm. Using a pry bar, you can pry along the lower ball joint assembly area here and just try your best to get this control arm to just release it from the ball joint. Now remember, you've got many years of corrosion working against you here, so it may not be so forthcoming coming off, so sometimes it just helps to use a hammer to pound it off and so forth. What I like to use here is actually the end of a pole to actually push it right off if need be. And so what happens is that if it's stubborn and it doesn't want to come off, then you're just going to have to keep trying until it does. Okay guys, if all else fails from prying on the control arm, which I've been doing so for the last little bit, you have to realize that on the back the pinch bolt actually is held in like this, in this manner, pinching through to clamp onto the ball joint stem, which is this. So what you can do to help ease the removal is to, of course, spray lots of WD-40 on top of the stem, which you can reach from the back of this rotor assembly. but to also jam a pry bar in between the two metal sections, I guess, and pry it so that this part opens up and doesn't grip the stem of the ball joint so tightly. And then last but not least, this is your best friend. What you need to do to break the rust free is to actually smack the ball joint or the control arm from the underside to break the rust loose, and then from the top side of the front, give it a solid whack like this to remove that off of the vehicle. And once that's been done, you can just simply wrestle this entire assembly out of the vehicle. This is how it all comes out in the end. So where the play is happening here on this ball joint is, if you actually take a look, you can actually see that there's some lateral movement on this ball joint, and it's very loose. And this ball joint here is part of this control arm assembly, so this is why we need to replace this whole bit. And as you can tell, also on the back side, this compliance bushing is beginning to tear, and just overall this whole piece is just slowly falling apart. So we're going to install the new one now, but prior to doing so, we're going to make sure we put lots and lots of chassis grease onto the new stem. We're also going to making sure that all of our bolt threads are nice and clean, using either a wire brush or a Dremel tool, and then putting ample amounts of lubricant and anti-seize prior to reinstalling everything. And the key thing is to make sure that we install everything and screw it in by hand or hand ratchet, and then ultimately either using your torque wrench or just using your own personal gauge of strength to tighten all the various fasteners. Okay guys, so what I'm doing here is I've just finished inspecting the threads on these suspension bolts very carefully to make sure that they're not stripped, stretched, or have any excessive corrosion built up onto them. And I'm putting tremendous gobs of anti-seize onto it just so that it helps ease the installation process, as well as protect the threads from corrosion should you actually have to remove these bolts ever again. Now, when we're doing the install, I said that we want to loosely install this and torque all the bolts by hand ever so carefully. And the reason why is that you don't want to strip the chassis bolts using an impact gun, because once you do that, I'm not sure how the heck you would rethread something like that, especially when the chassis bolts themselves are made out of hardened steel. So better safe than sorry. You'd rather take your time putting everything in, right? It's fairly easy to do, so we'll leave it at that. We want to take our chassis grease here and liberally cover this whole stem section so that it goes in nice and smooth. It seals this boot against any grease and junk and just, well, makes your life a lot easier. So let's go ahead and slide this control arm piece carefully back into the chassis, and then we'll start bolting things together. Now the easiest way to install this is to insert the back tongue piece in the rear joint, and then ever so carefully sliding this front bushing in as well. Now, because this is a brand new control arm with brand new bushings and rubber spacers, you're going to have to end up wrestling with this a little bit to get it to go in properly. Now, one thing's for certain is that it helps to have a helper to help put this in. It also helps to have a mini sledge just to gently tap this arm in, because you don't want to start smacking it the way you smack the old arm, because you just end up bending it or denting it and weakening the component. But because all these parts are so new, we need to just sort of finesse our way to get this piece in. Once everything is installed and lined up in a rough manner, you can just use your mini sledge and ever so carefully against the outer frame of this control arm tap it so that the ball joint is fully seated in the knuckle, and then reinstall your pinch bolts and suspension bolts. Okay guys, now that I've hand tight installed the rear aluminum mount portion to the chassis body, I can't actually tighten the front control arm bolt until I actually preload this bushing. And what preloading means is that basically you're going to be tightening this bushing assembly while the car is essentially at the stable position in say as if you've got the vehicle parked. And so what I'm doing is that I'm actually jacking up the lower control arm with that front bolt loose, I'm going to continue jacking it up until the vehicle begins to lift off of my jack stand and main jack. And that means that this control arm now is essentially at the height that it would be sitting at loaded. This is what we call loading. When this is like this, then we can begin to tighten that bolt. And as you saw, when I took it off, I'd use a breaker bar, so it is quite tight, so you need to tighten it accordingly. But in a nutshell, preloading means that resting state, not jacked up where there's no pressure on the arm. And the reason why that's just important is that it's for ride quality and geometry of the suspension. So now we can go ahead and tighten up that last bolt. So I actually had to use the aid of a helper just to hold the ratchet portion onto that front control arm bolt, and I was actually under the vehicle using my leg to push the ratchet in the direction that I needed to go to tighten the bolt. But basically once that's done, we can go ahead and lower this hydraulic jack and using the wood block to protect the control arm. Don't jack against the ball joint, remember, jack on the flat portion of the control arm underneath here and raise it to the point where it begins to lift off the jack stands. And basically tighten everything down. And once that's done, you're essentially finished and you've basically replaced the lower ball joint or compliance bushings, or I guess in a nutshell, the entire lower control arm assembly on your Murano. So basically put your wheel back on, take it for a quick test drive, make sure you torque all your lug nuts down properly after driving for about 5 kilometers. I hope you found this video useful and informative. Rate, comment, and subscribe.